Good morning, friends. We're on Chapter 12, Purring Like a Giant Cat. A few days after Mossadegh's surrender to the new regime, a platoon of soldiers appeared at his suite in the officers' club. The new Prime Minister, Fazlullah Zahedi, had ordered him transferred to a military prison. There he remained for 10 weeks while an indictment was drawn up. When it was ready, Mossadegh was brought before a military tribunal and charged with treason for having resisted the Shah's dismissal order and for inciting the people to armed insurrection. He defended himself vigorously, asserting that the firman had been delivered as part of a midnight coup d'etat and was in any case illegal, since Iranian prime ministers could not be dismissed without a no-confidence vote in the Majlis. "My only crime," Mossadegh told his judges, "is that I nationalized the Iranian oil industry and removed from this land the network of colonialism and the political and economic influence of the greatest empire on earth." The guilty verdict was a foregone conclusion. Along with it came the sentence, 3 years in prison, followed by house arrest for life. Mossadegh served the full prison term, and upon his release in the summer of 1956, was brought to his home in Ahmadabad. One morning soon after his arrival, the new secret police, called Savak, organized a crude maneuver to impress upon him the terms of his incarceration. A gang of thugs turned up in front of his home, and they began shouting violent anti-Mossadegh slogans. At their head was none other than the gang leader Shaban the Brainless, who had become one of the regime's favorite enforcers. For a time, the mob seemed ready to storm the house. It retreated after one of Mossadegh's grandsons fired several rifle shots into the air from inside. Several minutes later, 2 Savak officers arrived and asked to see the prisoner. They carried a letter for him to sign. It was a request that Savak agents be assigned to protect him. Mossadegh, who understood the realities of power, signed it without protest. Within an hour, Savak agents took up posts outside and inside the walled complex where he lived. Their standing orders, which did not change for the rest of Mossadegh's life, were to allow no one other than relatives and a few close friends to visit him. In the weeks following the coup, most of Mossadegh's cabinet ministers and prominent supporters were arrested. Some were later released without charge, others served prison terms after being convicted of various offenses. 600 military officers loyal to Mossadegh were also arrested, and about 60 of them were shot. So were several student leaders at Tehran University. Tuda and the National Front were banned, and their most prominent supporters were either imprisoned or killed. Hussein Fatimi, who had been Mossadegh's foreign minister, was the most prominent figure singled out for exemplary punishment. Fatimi was a zealous anti-monarchist, and during the turbulent days of August 1953 he had attacked the Shah, whom he called the Baghdad fugitive, with special venom. Iran had fallen into its misery. Fatimi asserted at one point, because for the last 10 years a dirty, hateful, and shameful royal court had been the servant of the British embassy. In one speech he addressed the absent monarch. "O traitor Shah, you shameless person, you have completed the criminal history of the Pahlavi regime. The people want revenge. They want to drag you from behind your desk to the gallows. Now that the tables were turned, the Shah had his chance, and he did not miss it. Just as he had promised Kermit Roosevelt, he arranged for Fatimi to be summarily tried, convicted of treason, and executed." Fatimi had once compared the Shah to a snake who bites mortally when the opportunity presents itself. In the end, he was among those who suffered the deadly bite. Because of his fate, and also because he was the only member of Mossadegh's inner circle who was a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, his memory is honored in Iran today. One of the main boulevards in Tehran is Dr. Hussein Fatimi Avenue. In the years after Mossadegh fell from power, Mohammad Reza Shah made himself a non-person about whom it was considered unseemly to speak. Little could be published about him, and nothing at all that was positive. In 1962, having consolidated his increasingly repressive regime, the Shah allowed the National Front to emerge from its illegality and hold a rally, on the condition that each speaker mentioned Mossadegh's name just once. 100,000 people turned out. They knew the stipulation the Shah had placed on speakers, and when each mentioned Mossadegh the allotted one time, they let out a thunderous cheer. That was the last time the Shah allowed the National Front to gather in public. Mossadegh's wife died in 1965. Although she had stayed in Tehran during the years he was at Ahmadabad, they remained very close, and her death severely affected him. In a letter to a friend, he wrote that he was deeply in pain from this tragedy, and now I pray God take me soon, too, and relieve me of this pathetic existence." Several months later, he developed an ailment that was diagnosed as throat cancer. Mohammad Reza Shah sent him a message suggesting that he seek treatment abroad, but Mossadegh refused and chose an Iranian medical team instead. He traveled to Tehran with a police escort and spent several months there under medical treatment. Doctors succeeded in removing his tumor, but then subjected him to heavy doses of cobalt. That may have done more harm than good. His health continued to decline. On March 5, 1967, at the age of 85, he died. No public funeral or other expression of mourning was permitted. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which later changed its name to British Petroleum, tried to return to its old position in Iran, but public opinion was so opposed that the new government could not permit it. Besides, the logic of power dictated that since the United States had done the dirty work of overthrowing Mossadegh, American companies should share the spoils. Ultimately, an international consortium was organized to assume the rich concession. Anglo-Iranian held 40% of the shares. 5 American companies together held another 40%, and the remainder was distributed to Royal Dutch Shell and Compagnie Française des Pétroles. Sorry, that's awful. The non-British companies paid Anglo-Iranian $1 billion for their 60% of the concession. Although the consortium was run by foreigners, it retained the name Mossadegh gave it, National Iranian Oil Company, to preserve the facade of nationalization. It agreed to share its profits with Iran on a 50-50 basis, but not to open its books to Iranian auditors or to allow Iranians onto its board of directors. In the years that followed, Mohammad Reza Shah became increasingly isolated and dictatorial. He crushed dissent by whatever means necessary and spent huge amounts of money on weaponry, $10 billion in the United States alone between 1972 and 1976. He had that amount of free cash because of the sharp increase in oil prices during those years. The $4 billion that Iran received from the consortium in 1973 reached $19 billion just 2 years later. On the rare occasions when he mentioned Mossadegh, the Shah was contemptuous of his infantile xenophobia and strident nationalism. He told one friend, "The worst years of my reign, indeed of my entire life, came when Mossadegh was prime minister. The bastard was out for blood, and every morning I awoke with the sensation that today might be my last on the throne." When Iranians' anger began boiling over in the late 70s, the Shah found that since he had crushed all legitimate political parties and other opposition groups, there was no one with whom he could negotiate a compromise. In desperation, he named a Prime Minister, Shapur Bakhtiar, who had been Deputy Minister of Labor in Mossadegh's government. The Shah must have felt history's breath on his neck when Bakhtiar visited Mossadegh's grave in Ahmadabad immediately after taking office, made a speech there, pledging fidelity to Mossadegh's ideals, named a government made up largely of National Front sympathizers, and placed a photo of Mossadegh behind him whenever he addressed the press. At that point, however, doom was so close that the Shah had no choice but to accept such effrontery. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini who as a young mullah had strongly opposed Mossadegh, emerged in the late 1970s as Mohammad Reza Shah's most potent enemy. The Shah had sent him into exile in 1964, but from Turkey, Iraq, and finally Paris, he continued preaching his fundamentalist message. When Bakhtiar became prime minister, Khomeini scorned and denounced him. "Why do you talk of the Shah, Mossadegh, money?" he demanded in one radio speech. "These have already passed. Islam is all that remains." In one of the most stunning political collapses of the 20th century, the Shah was forced to flee his homeland in January 1979. This time the CIA was not able to return him to his throne. The next year he died in Egypt, reviled by almost everyone. Ayatollah Khomeini replaced him as the arbiter of Iran's destiny. Men associated with Mossadegh and his ideals dominated Khomeini's first government. The prime minister was Mehdi Bazargan, whom Mossadegh had dispatched to Abadan in 1951 to run the refinery there after the British departed. Ibrahim Yazdi, the head of a small political party dedicated to preserving Mossadegh's legacy, became deputy prime minister and then foreign minister. In the first post-revolutionary election, Khomeini permitted another Mossadegh admirer, Abul Hassan Bani Sadr, to run for and win the presidency. For a brief period after the revolution, it seemed that from the grave, Mossadegh was returning to power. The high school in Ahmadabad was named after him. So was the main street in Tehran, which had formerly been Pahlavi Avenue. A commemorative stamp was issued in his honor. On March 5, 1979, the 12th anniversary of his death, an enormous crowd flooded into Ahmadabad. It was one of the largest gatherings in modern Iranian history. People had to park their cars miles away and walk the rest of the distance. President Bani Sadr led the tributes and announced plans to move Mossadegh's body to a mausoleum in Tehran. The family demurred, widely suspecting that if political tides changed, the mausoleum might be desecrated. These tributes to Mossadegh were in part an effort by Iranians to give him the homage they had not been permitted to give while the Shah was in power. They were also intended as a message to Ayatollah Khomeini and his mullahs. By celebrating Mossadegh, Iranians were expressing their wish for a regime like his, nationalist, democratic, and based on the rule of law. It soon became clear that Khomeini had not the slightest intention of establishing such a regime. He had broadened his mass appeal by embracing supporters of the National Front, but as soon as he consolidated power, he pushed them out. Before long, he began arresting them. Among those who had to flee the country to save their lives was Hedayat Matin Daftari, the only one of Mossadegh's grandchildren who had been bold enough to venture into politics. The window that had been opened for Mossadegh's admirers was now closed. Tehran's main street was renamed again, this time in honor of the 12th Imam. Mossadegh's secularism was as abhorrent to the new regime as his democratic vision had been to the old one. The mullahs, like Mohammad Reza Shah before them, came to realize that allowing Iranians to honor Mossadegh would inevitably lead to calls for a government based on his principles that they could not tolerate, and so they did all they could to suppress his memory. Out of the frying pan into the fire. Poor Iran. Have a good day, friends.